This is the largest airplane ever built, the Hughes flying boat nicknamed the Spruce Goose. Its strange and controversial career and its unique size and design have guaranteed it a permanent place in aviation history. It was test flown once in 1947 with designer and builder Howard Hughes at the controls. The flight lasted less than a minute. The plane never flew again. The Spruce Goose was maintained in this storage hangar in Long Beach, California, and hidden from view for 33 years. Hughes died in 1976. At last, it seemed the marvelous flying boat might have to be dismembered, with sections slated for display in several museums. But the outcome was a happy one. The Rather Corporation, in an agreement with the Aero Club of Southern California and the Suma Corporation, stepped in and saved the great airplane. A huge dome was built to house it alongside the Queen Mary in Long Beach. A flyover of famous old aircraft was part of the opening day celebration for the Spruce Goose attraction on May 14, 1983. Bonita and Jack Rather officiated at the ceremonies, and actor Jimmy Stewart cut the ribbon. The permanent home of the Spruce Goose is in every way suitable for the mighty seaplane. It too is unique, the largest freestanding geodesic dome ever built. It's as tall as a 13-story building and 415 feet in diameter. The chronicle of Howard Hughes, the legendary and eccentric character who designed, built, and flew the Spruce Goose, is as remarkable as that of the great airplane itself. Howard Robard Hughes was born in Houston, Texas in 1905. His father amassed a fortune by inventing and marketing a unique oil drilling bit. Young Howard also showed a remarkable mechanical aptitude, even fitting a motor to his bicycle. Then at the age of 19, he inherited the Hughes Tool Company, and for the rest of his life, he was a wealthy man. Hughes moved to Los Angeles, determined to become a movie producer. After a modest start, he undertook an epic film about the flyers of World War I and collected a fleet of authentic fighter planes. The film was ready for release when talking pictures became a reality. Hughes reshot his movie in sound. Hell's Angels, released in 1930, cost an unprecedented $6 million. It was an instant hit and is now a screen classic. Hughes was a born showman, and more great films followed, including Scarface and The Front Page. But he had another passion, flying. He broke several long-distance speed records, and in 1937, he flew coast to coast in just under 7.5 hours. This is the H-1 racer that he designed and flew. President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented him with the Harmon Trophy, and Hughes had become as famous a flyer as Charles Lindbergh. A replica of his H-1 racer is on display next to the Spruce Goose. In 1939, Hughes flew around the world in a Lockheed Lodestar. He reached Paris here in half the time Lindbergh had needed 11 years before. Hughes continued eastward with refueling stops and returned to a ticker tape parade in New York. He had circled the globe in less than 4 days. It was a new record. After Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser proposed a fleet of huge seaplanes for transporting troops and supplies to far-off battle zones. Nazi U-boats had been sinking scores of Allied supply vessels, but these cargo planes would be able to fly far above that danger. Kaiser joined forces with Howard Hughes, who also had an eye for grand enterprises, and they secured a government contract to design and build the plane. Hughes put his engineers to work. At Culver City, California, Hughes built a special hangar in which the giant plane could be constructed. The unprecedented size of the flying boat meant that new tools and techniques had to be devised, and the work progressed slowly. Hughes, always a perfectionist, personally oversaw even the tiniest details. Because of the wartime shortage of metals, the plane had to be fabricated entirely of wood. Birch was selected and was shaped, laminated, and bonded through a unique process that produced a smooth, hard outer surface. Kaiser left the project, and by the time the war ended in 1945, military urgency for the giant flying boat had long since vanished. But Hughes, convinced that his unique plane was important for aeronautical research, spent more than $7 million of his own money on its completion. In June 1946, the plane's hull and two wing sections were moved to Long Beach for final assembly and for the eventual flight testing of the seaplane in the harbor. The 28-mile route from Culver City was carefully mapped out. Roads and bridges were checked for strength. Trees were trimmed, power lines raised. The move took 5 days. As the immense components were slowly transported toward Long Beach, 100,000 spectators lined the route, and children in nearby schools were recessed from class to watch. During the war, Hughes had also secured a government contract for a photo reconnaissance airplane, the XF-11. His customary perfectionism again delayed the work, and it was 1946 before the prototype was completed. On July 7th, Hughes flew it through a variety of tests. A propeller abruptly malfunctioned and the plane crashed in Beverly Hills. Hughes was nearly killed. His injuries would cause him pain the rest of his life. Work continued on the giant flying boat. It was to be powered by 8 radial Pratt & Whitney engines. Critics claimed the huge plane would never fly, but Hughes pursued his own convictions as usual. He projected a cruising speed of 200 miles per hour. Like any other prominent figure, Hughes had made political enemies. His flying boat still had not flown, and he was accused of having profited from his wartime contracts. In August 1947, he was summoned before a Senate investigating committee. Although he made a masterful presentation of his case, his untried wooden seaplane was derisively called a flying lumberyard of the Spruce Goose. Hughes was later entirely vindicated, but those nicknames rankled. He pushed his big plane to completion. Stan Soderberg, now custodian of the Spruce Goose, went to work for Howard Hughes on the airplane in 1946.
When I was hired on, it was a job that was called a trimmer, which entails working with fabric. I was a parachute rigger in the Navy, and so it was parallel to that.
On November 2nd, 1947, the Spruce Goose was towed out into Long Beach Harbor. Thousands of spectators lined the shore. Hughes announced he would not try to fly the plane then. This would be a taxi test only. Flight testing would come the following year. At this time, there were 32 people on board the plane, including 7 news reporters chosen by lottery. A hydraulics engineer sat at Hughes' right side. The flying boat was so big that for the first time in history, muscle power alone was not enough to manipulate the controls of an airplane. The hydraulic system that was used multiplied the pilot's strength 200 times. The first taxi run was at 45 miles an hour. Hughes swung the plane around and taxied a second time at 70. On the third run, he called for 15 degrees flaps, pushed the 8 engines to full throttle, and the largest airplane ever built lifted off the water. It flew about a mile and reached an altitude of 70 feet. It was one of aviation's truly epic flights. Stan Soderberg was in a launch nearby. He describes the start of the third run.
We're laying off the side of the airplane, and it was laying dead in the water, and he only had 1 engine running at the time. He cranked them all up, and the flaps come down, and and he gave her throttles, and as it picked up speed, it's up on the step and away she went.
How did you feel when the big plane lifted off?
My personal feelings were like you made the winning touchdown in the Rose Bowl. We were all very happy and excited for Mr. Hughes and for those of us that had worked on the airplane for the previous year.
Afterwards, when Hughes was asked why he changed his mind and actually took off, he said in a characteristic understatement, "I like to make surprises." Did Hughes plan all along to fly that day?
Only Mr. Hughes knows that, but probably in the back of his mind he thought about it, but I know that he didn't want to kill himself and a bunch of people to prove a point. But I feel after the first slow run and the second high-speed run that everything felt good to him, and on the third one, when he put the flaps down, there was no doubt about it in anyone's mind that knew anything about this airplane.
The surprise takeoff was not only a personal triumph for Hughes, it was convincing proof that such gigantic cargo planes were practical after all. But there was no longer a military urgency for his giant flying boat, and Hughes eventually returned to movie making and then more and more to commercial aviation. The popular outcry that arose when it was thought the Spruce Goose might be dismembered proved that the great seaplane had long since established its own special place in the affections of people everywhere. As soon as it was placed on public view, it became one of the most popular attractions in the country. Years before this time, the nickname Spruce Goose had become a universal term of endearment. On the point of accuracy, however, the name is an error, because the only spruce used in its construction is a small amount in the wing spars. So that visitors can inspect the Spruce Goose close up, stairways and viewing platforms have been built on one side up to the level of the cockpit and the flight deck. Up here, close to the mighty engines, it's possible to appreciate something of their enormous size and power. The four-bladed propellers are 17 feet long. The Spruce Goose could carry enough gasoline to drive the average modern family car around the world 15 times. In the pilot's seat is a startlingly lifelike mannequin of Howard Hughes, dressed as he was on the day of the momentous flight. Hughes followed an individualistic approach in virtually every project he undertook, and he always preferred to act as his own test pilot. He once said, "Why should I pay somebody else to have all the fun?" Viewing windows have been cut into the side of the plane to give visitors a chance to see the instrument panels and the passenger seats located midships on the flight deck. There were 2 flight engineers on duty during the flight of the Spruce Goose. Part of their job was to monitor fuel and oil and to be certain the engines responded to the pilot's commands. With 8 Pratt & Whitneys to oversee, they were busy men. The crew could enter the wing from the flight deck for in-flight inspection and adjustment of the engines. The wing, here at the point where it joins the hull, measures 13 feet between its top and bottom surfaces. On the next level below the flight deck is the cavernous cargo hold. This is the view looking toward the tail. The red tanks are CO2 bottles for use in the fire control system. Here, visitors are able to enter the flying boat itself and inspect the cargo area from an interior viewing enclosure. The design payload of the Spruce Goose was 200,000 pounds, equal to its own weight. It was to provide fast and safe transportation for either 750 fully outfitted combat troops or 2 tanks. This was far greater than any cargo ever dreamed of for an airplane up to that time. An authentic Sherman tank, model M4A1, widely used in World War II, is on display inside the dome next to the Spruce Goose. The aircraft was designed to carry 2 of this type of medium tank. At one time, the nose of the plane had clamshell doors to permit cargo loading directly into the hold. But before the test flight, they were replaced with the present solid nose. One of the most exciting added attractions at the Spruce Goose is the light show. Computer-operated banks of 1,000-watt floodlights in white, royal blue, red, amber, and peacock blue bathe the seaplane in ever-changing splashes of vivid color. The tints are produced not by the usual gelatin filters, but by stained glass. The light show offers special fun for the color photographer. The entire program of colored lights runs about 10 minutes and alternates with a 3-minute interval of steady white illumination when all the lights are on full. There's a cutaway engine on display that turns in slow motion to demonstrate its operation. Visitors are always impressed with the fact that these engines, built well before the jet age was born, are rated at over 3,000 horsepower each, and the plane has 8 of them. From nose to tail, the Spruce Goose is more than 218 feet in length. Its wings stretch 320 feet from tip to tip, longer than a football field. The plane is so big, in fact, that the only real way to appreciate its enormous size is through comparisons. Here are 2. A DC-10 could be parked under each of these giant wings. The flying boat's horizontal tail surface is longer than the entire wingspan of a Boeing 727, and the vertical fin rises 80 feet above the ground. One of the early design proposals called for twin hulls, but that was rejected in favor of a single fuselage. The Goose still rests on the same cradle on which it was stored for so many years. The reflecting pool here greatly enhances the beauty and drama of the setting. Besides the plane itself, the dome contains many exhibits relating to the Goose and to Howard Hughes. Several short audiovisual programs offer a wealth of interesting background information. There's also a well-stocked gift shop and a convenient snack bar. The Spruce Goose and the man who built and flew it are each one of a kind, authentic examples of American inventiveness and enterprise. Here, in the glare of floodlights, the plane exerts a strong and mysterious fascination, just as Hughes himself did when he was in the public eye. Everyone who visits the Spruce Goose and the Queen Mary as well nearby should remember that in each case it was literally an 11th hour rescue that preserved them from destruction. Now, with so many people visiting and enjoying them every day, it scarcely seems possible that we nearly lost them both. The Spruce Goose and the Queen Mary, 2 of mankind's great triumphs of technology, are now neighboring giants here in Long Beach. Companion attractions presented by Rather Port Properties Limited. Their final home is a happy one. Howard Hughes, a master showman with an eye for grand enterprises, would still feel very proud of his famous flying boat. The Royal Mail ship Queen Mary is the most famous of all transatlantic luxury liners. From the time of her maiden voyage in 1936, the ship has held a unique place in history and in the hearts of the British and American people. She has become the symbol of an era, a magnificent relic of a style of travel that has all but vanished. The Queen Mary is now operated by Rather Port Properties Limited. She's one of the country's foremost tourist attractions, with a hotel and restaurants on board and many exhibits relating to the ship's extraordinary history. Alongside her is the world's largest geodesic dome, which houses a companion attraction, the Spruce Goose, the famous flying boat built by Howard Hughes. The Queen Mary, once the premier liner of the North Atlantic Service, has been permanently berthed here in the harbor of Long Beach, California since 1967. How did this famous British ship find her final home in a Pacific port? Her story actually begins over a century and a half ago. Samuel Cunard, a native of Nova Scotia, founded the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company in England in 1839. The following year, the tiny paddle wheel steamship Britannia began the Cunard Line's transatlantic service. Charles Dickens, her most famous passenger, was greatly offended by the discomforts of the voyage and described the ship's dining saloon as a hearse with windows. But a parade of great Cunard liners followed in her wake, each faster and more splendid than the last. Among the grandest of them all was the Mauretania, which began service in 1907. For 22 years, she was the fastest passenger ship on the North Atlantic. She was enormously popular and a lovely vessel as well. Her speed record was beaten at last in 1929 by a brand new German liner on her maiden voyage. 5 years later, the magnificent Mauretania was retired and broken up for scrap. Construction of the Queen Mary was begun in the shipyard of John Brown of Clydebank near Glasgow, Scotland on December 1st, 1930. From the start, the ship was known only as Job Number 534. She was not given her name until the moment she was launched. A long shutdown caused by the Great Depression delayed her completion. But with financial help from the government, the men were brought back to work, and the huge ship was finished at last. On September 26, 1934, a cold, rainy day, King George V and Queen Mary of England greeted the huge crowd that had come to see the launching of Job Number 534.
It has been the nation's will that she should be completed, and today we can send her forth, no longer a number on the books, but a ship with a name.
The time has come for Queen Mary to reveal the name of the new liner.
I am happy to name this ship the Queen Mary. I wish success to her and to all who sail in her.
The Queen presses the button to start the ship down the ways. The River Clyde had to be widened at this point to accommodate the Queen Mary's 1,020-foot length. The vessel is now ready for fitting out, after which she will be an incredible 81,000 tons. The great ship left Southampton for New York on her maiden voyage in late afternoon of May 27, 1936. In service and luxury, she surpassed any liner that had ever put to sea before. Cunard and the British people had every reason to feel proud. There was an air of excitement throughout the ship, as if everyone on board knew that history was being made. She arrived in New York on June 1st to an exuberant American reception. The new vessel had become instantly popular. She continued a regular schedule of successful transatlantic crossings for the next 3 years, vying with the Normandy, pride of the French line, for the title of the fastest liner afloat. World War II broke out in Europe in September 1939. The Queen Mary and the first Queen Elizabeth, Britain's 2 largest liners, were soon taken into government service as troop transports. Both were radically altered inside and out. This RAF orderly room was formerly the Queen Mary's nursery. In 1942, briefly and for the only time, the 3 greatest liners ever built, the 2 Queens with the Normandy at the left, were tied up alongside each other in New York. This is one of the most dramatic pictures in all of maritime history. On October 2nd, 1942, the Queen Mary, with over 10,000 American troops on board, collided with the British cruiser Curaçao, one of her escorts. The cruiser was cut in 2. The Queen, obliged to follow standing orders in waters infested with U-boats, could not stop. The Americans rushed to the rails and threw life jackets to their stricken comrades in the water. But the cruiser sank almost at once, and 329 British sailors were lost. After that dreadful tragedy, the Queen Mary's severely damaged bow was repaired, and she returned to her troop-carrying duties. On one Atlantic crossing in 1943, she carried 16,683 people, which, as her log reported dramatically, was the greatest number of human beings ever embarked in one vessel. The Queen Mary was armed with anti-aircraft guns, and the British and American gun crews drilled regularly. Fortunately, the ship was never fired upon and was never obliged to fire a shot at an enemy. The Queen shuttled Allied troops all over the world, usually sailing alone. Her great speed provided more safety than a slower convoy would, and she could easily outrun enemy submarines. She even visited South America. In tropical waters, the ship, which had no air conditioning, became extremely hot below decks. As many veterans recall, conditions on board were unbelievably crowded. Every inch of space was used. Bunks were even jammed into the empty swimming pool. Prime Minister Winston Churchill made several wartime crossings in the ship, en route to conferences with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. On one of his trips, a North Atlantic gale slammed a monstrous wave broadside against the Queen. The great ship heeled over until her upper decks were awash. And then at long last, she slowly righted herself again. With the end of World War II in 1945, the Queen Mary engaged in the happy task of carrying American GIs back to the States. Many men were wounded, and sick bay, once the ship's first-class main lounge was packed. For every man on board, time couldn't pass fast enough. The war was over at last, and they were going home. The Queen Mary's final military service was a series of voyages in 1946, bringing British war brides across the Atlantic to join their husbands in the United States and Canada. Altogether, the ship transported more than 30,000 brides and babies. Perhaps on these trips, more than on any others in her whole career, the ship carried with her a greater cargo of happiness and eager anticipation. The Queen Mary underwent refitting for her return to transatlantic passenger service. She was repainted in the black, white, and red colors of peacetime. During the war, she and the Queen Elizabeth had transported about 1.5 million troops all told. Winston Churchill paid glowing tribute to the wartime work of both gallant vessels. Without their aid, he said, the day of final victory must unquestionably have been postponed. When she left Liverpool in the summer of 1947 on her first post-war commercial voyage, her suites and first-class staterooms were even more luxurious than before. The most expensive accommodations could run as high as $5,000 round trip. Newly redecorated suites and staterooms, their walls gleaming with paneling and inlays, showed in exquisite workmanship why the great vessel had always been known as the Ship of Beautiful Woods. The bath provided not only hot and cold fresh water, but hot and cold salt water as well. And a warm saltwater soak was said to be very relaxing. But there were, of course, 3 classes of passengers, each with different accommodations and separate public rooms, and the 3 mixed only at Sunday services. For first-class passengers, the tone was quite formal. One dressed for dinner. Later in the evening, there would be dancing or a festive party, perhaps followed by a game of cards in one of the ship's lavish public rooms. The private accommodations of the captain's cabin were surprisingly Spartan, considering his position. An invitation to visit his sitting room for tea was extended to many distinguished passengers. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor often sailed on the Queen Mary, as well as famous figures of the entertainment world on both sides of the Atlantic, including Gloria Swanson, Noel Coward, Fred Astaire, and Laurel and Hardy. Bob Hope often found time to entertain his fellow passengers. In August 1938, the Queen Mary had been the first passenger steamship ever to cross the Atlantic in less than 4 days. Her average speed then was over 31.5 knots. For the 20 years of her post-war career, she continued to be a fast and comfortable ship, carrying on with the Queen Elizabeth the weekly transatlantic service for which the 2 great vessels had originally been designed. But the golden age of the great ocean liners was waning. By the 1960s, people who were in a hurry, and nearly everyone was, could fly between America and Europe in a matter of hours. Ocean travel was now too slow. Leisurely shipboard luxury fell out of favor, and the Times of London called the Queen Mary and her companions in the Atlantic service limping leviathans. Passenger revenues plummeted. The ship was losing £750,000 a year, and in May 1967, when she was 31 years old, she was taken out of service. The possibility grew that she might be scrapped. At very nearly the last minute, the city of Long Beach bought the vessel from Cunard. The Queen Mary would be moored at that California port to serve as a convention center and tourist attraction. Thousands of well-wishers came to say goodbye when the Queen Mary left her home port for the last time. She was too big for the Panama Canal. On her final voyage of 40 days and more than 14,500 miles, she carried nearly 1,500 passengers through the storms of Cape Horn and around South America. She arrived at Long Beach to a tumultuous welcome, and a vast flotilla of small craft escorted her to her new home in the New World. The liner was put into dry dock in the U.S. Naval Shipyard in Long Beach, the only dock in California large enough to accommodate her. Her bottom was cleaned and prepared for permanent berthing. Parts of the Queen Mary's interior had to be renovated before she would be ready for her new career. And this was accomplished by first removing her 3 huge stacks. The vessel would never again sail under her own power, and space was needed inside her for museum exhibits and convention facilities. Her boilers and 2 of her 4 power plants were taken out. When her new aluminum stacks were all in place, the time had come for the Queen Mary to be moved for the last time. Small boat owners and people from the news media flocked to Long Beach Harbor. The huge ship, guided carefully by a squadron of tugboats, moved slowly and majestically toward her permanent home at Pier J. Her new berth, with its access towers and mooring facilities, was all ready for her. Actress Greer Garson, as elegantly British as the Queen Mary herself, was hostess of the installation ceremonies. Ship enthusiasts realized with a pang of sorrow that this was the Queen Mary's final mooring. She would never leave this site. And yet, everyone who has ever seen the great ship and responded to her beauty is surely grateful that she has not shared the tragic fate of the Mauritania. Here at Pier J, inside her own breakwater, the Queen Mary would be safe from all danger. The vessel was later leased from the city of Long Beach by the Rather Corporation and is now operated not only as an attraction, but also as a first-class hotel. There are nearly 400 rooms, all of which are refurbished staterooms, carefully maintained as they were when the ship was in service. There are also several excellent restaurants on board. One of the greatest ships in history is here for the viewing. Open for both guided and self-guided tours, as well as scheduled talks and demonstrations by ship's officers on a variety of nautical subjects, including knots and signals. Uniformed personnel are on hand at key locations to answer questions. There are interesting shops in Piccadilly Circus and elsewhere on the prom deck. The coastal setting here at Long Beach is filled with variety and interest. And on clear days, there are some truly astonishing views. The wheelhouse, which was off limits to passengers when the vessel was underway, is now a high point of the ship's tour. All instruments and brasswork are kept flawlessly polished in true maritime fashion. The navigating bridge, too, was for ship's crew only. It was from here that the captain and the pilot often conned the ship during her arrivals and departures from port. The outboard ends of the navigating bridge extend beyond the ship's sides, and you can stand there and look straight down to the water. Shipboard visitors always enjoy meeting Captain John Gregory, genial host of the Queen Mary. Every visitor should have a stroll on the prom deck. With a little imagination, it's almost possible to feel the ship roll a bit under your feet, as if she were still plowing through the North Atlantic swells. Much of the forward deck gear of the ship looks just as it did when she was at sea. The anchor winches and chains are truly enormous, and they needed to be. Each of her 2 bow anchors weighs 16 tons. There are many reminders on board of the Queen Mary's illustrious wartime career. A 40mm anti-aircraft gun is set up aft on the sun deck near the veranda grill. It seems to have made a special hit with the youngsters. Farther forward on the sun deck, there are extensive exhibits relating to the war, and shipboard scenes have been recreated that stir the memories of those veterans, British and American alike, who visit the vessel. A number of the scenes are based on documentary photographs of the period. At the start of every voyage, passengers were required to try on life jackets and to participate in a lifeboat drill, so they would know what to do in an emergency. Experienced officers now conduct demonstrations of these procedures and even lower one of the Queen's lifeboats some distance over the side. An ocean liner is actually a city at sea. Every eventuality had to be foreseen for the convenience, health, and safety of the passengers. There were beauty shops and barber shops, fully equipped and staffed. There was a doctor's dispensary on board, an infirmary, and even a small operating room with a surgeon on call. The Queen also boasted a number of luxuries one might not expect. This exhibit duplicates a corner of the gymnasium with original exercise equipment. Fitness-oriented passengers could enjoy a brisk run around the promenade deck. 4 complete laps were equal to a mile. In the chilly air of the North Atlantic, that must have been a stimulating experience. A visit to the Queen Mary's cavernous engine room is always an exciting part of any visitor's tour. This area and the bridge were quite literally the 2 nerve centers of the ship. Here, deep in the bowels of the ship, you can see much of the gigantic machinery that was used to drive and steer her. Few passengers ever saw this place. The ship's wireless room is now an active ham radio station, call letters W6RO, operated by the Associated Radio Amateurs of Long Beach. Some of the Queen Mary's original radio gear is still here, although it has been supplemented by modern equipment. Paul Lincoln, master ship model maker and consultant in maritime history, works in his shop on board the Queen Mary. The model here is of the Triumph, a British 74-gun ship of the line launched in 1764. All parts are handcrafted by Paul himself. When the model is completed, 3.5 years' work will have gone into it, and its value will be $150,000. The Grand Salon, seen here as it was in the 30s, is the largest room on any passenger ship. This was the first-class dining room, and the evening meal here was always a gala event. The room still looks very much as it did then. It's used now for meetings and banquets, and following the elegant Queen Mary tradition, a champagne brunch is served here every Sunday in a comfortably informal atmosphere. The brunch is rated as one of the finest anywhere. The observation lounge, considered by many visitors to be the most colorful and exciting room on the ship, is located on the prom deck. This was the cocktail bar for first-class passengers, and the atmosphere and Art Deco elegance of the 30s have been carefully preserved. The lounge is open to the public, with dancing and musical entertainment in the evening. The Queen Mary's Wedding Chapel is frequently booked for weddings which are performed by Captain Gregory. Receptions afterward are often held in one of the original banquet rooms on board. On shore, adjacent to both the Queen Mary and the Spruce Goose, is London Town, where the buildings are charming reproductions of those in an old English village. There are all sorts of fascinating architectural details that photographers in particular will enjoy. London Town offers a variety of fascinating gift and souvenir shops and several inviting restaurants, including the English pub. In the years of her North Atlantic service, the Queen Mary was a speedy and reliable link between two countries that share a common heritage. It's been said that no other ship since the Mayflower has been held in such affectionate regard on both sides of the ocean. Born in Great Britain, now permanently docked in America, the gallant Queen Mary links us still. She's a priceless maritime treasure, a technological triumph in mankind's eternal struggle with the sea. Those who love ships can only stand and admire her. Handsome, regal, justifiably proud, and feel thankful that she's still with us. She will always be Queen of the Seas.